Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. We have officially arrived at Penn State's first game week of the 2024 season. We were in James Franklin's press conference on Monday afternoon, noon, back in Beaver Stadium. That'll be our new kind of kickstart to weekly coverage. In the past, James Franklin's press conference has been on Tuesday afternoon. It's now Monday afternoon. And with that, we are off and running. Coverage over at Lions247.com by the bunches right now as we prepare for kickoff between the Nittany Lions and the West Virginia Mountaineers. Noon start to that one down in Morgantown. We will have a really nice breakdown of the Mountaineers coming your way on this episode from Chris Anderson, who's been covering West Virginia for a long time within our 24/7 Sports Network. We'll get a good feel for West Virginia's potential strengths, weaknesses, X factors, and just notes from all three phases of the game entering this matchup. But we begin the episode with focus on these Nittany Lions, who we just spent the last 3 weeks following through preseason camp coverage and now into game week. And Daniel, you and I and Mark Brennan and Grace Brennan will be back on the practice field Wednesday evening. That is our new routine. Again, we're getting settled into the game week routines, and we'll be out there Wednesday evening. But we've had a chance already on a Tuesday, not just to work our way through what we heard from James Franklin yesterday, but we had a few team veterans on Zoom calls from our respective houses today. And so we got a lot to catch up on. There's also big news within that athletic department. But let me just say to you, welcome to game week and kind of a new chapter for our coverage on the podcast, if those who've followed along in past falls.
Yeah, it feels good to be back. It's just kind of like riding a bike. I know that it's a little bit of a weird weekend because of Labor Day and you're not, completely locked into that routine, but it feels good to kind of have this structure for the next 14, 15, 16, 17, who knows how many weeks this is going to be. So I'm ready for it. I'm excited to really get going.
And James Franklin, as I said, got us going with that Monday press conference. And there are some takeaways from there that we're going to get into in just a moment. But I wanted to talk about the roster update that we got, really kind of in sync with that press conference. And you went back to your house and put a story up at Lions247 within an hour or so. We appreciate you. There's always a lot of details to work your way through when a roster update comes through. But I wanted to hear offensively, defensively. Let's start offense. What were some of the major moves that stood out to you?
I think the first one that a lot of people would notice is Drew Aller. He's listed at 235 pounds right now. That was down from 238 at the last roster update, which was in June. Aller spent most of last season in the 240s. I think that he hadn't been listed below 240 pounds since, I think, summer 2022. And one of the first updates after he enrolled and really got into that strength program. I think that tracks with what we've heard from Aller himself with what he wants to do this year. He wants to be leaner. He wants to be more mobile. And I think that we've heard similar things from James Franklin and what they're looking for out of Aller this year. I do think that even though he was 6'5", 246, 248 pounds, he still never really struck me as a statue back there. But I think that this will be a little bit more mobility. We've gotten eyes on him in that practice setting, going through some of those ball security drills. He doesn't really look like a big lumbering guy, going under pads, going around pads, going through pads. He looks pretty quick on his feet. I think he's moving well, moving confidently. So that's something that you see the number on the paper and it does line up with the eye test. Some of these, it's a little bit, like with the next one I had written down, like Nolan Rucci. He was down to 308 from 317. Our naked eyes, it's a little bit tougher to grasp that. I know that one was a bit of a piece of conversation on our board, especially given how James Franklin has talked about Nolan Rucci since he came over from Wisconsin. And one of the big things was, Wisconsin had trouble keeping weight on that frame. Rucci is 6'8". He's a big guy. And there's a lot of body there. But in looking through the roster, a lot of the other linemen on both sides of the ball are down a little bit too. Anthony Donko was down 6 pounds. Sal Wormley, I think, was down around 8 pounds. Smith Vilbert was down 10 pounds. Abdul Carter was down 7 pounds. I think that what you see from some of these linemen is that you go into camp a little bit bulked up. Caden Wallace talked to us about this last year. I think at one point he was listed at like 345, but he said that he was planning to play in the 320s. But he knew that with what camp is, how grueling it can be, you do lose a lot of weight and you kind of settle in. And that's what Caden Wallace said last year. I asked Anthony Donko about this going into the season because he was up at 336. He said something similar along those lines too. So I was kind of, I kind of just noted that. I don't think it's too much cause for concern as we get to later. Rucci and Donko are still competing for that right tackle job. But I think offensively, we'll talk about the freshmen in a little bit. These are the two kind of non-freshmen I think that stood out to me.
At running back, I think a lot of people will be surprised to note that Nick Singleton is 6 pounds heavier than Kaytron Allen going into this season. And I think there's that thunder and lightning label that got applied to them early on. While as Kaytron Allen had some excess weight when he was finishing high school, maybe when he got to campus, he's never been a guy that's really had that. I think this is, he's just toned up. He's all in. I mean, we've talked about it. This is not just junior seasons. This is final audition for the NFL for these guys, considering their trajectory, what they've already accomplished in Penn State uniforms and their athletic makeups. So kind of a good look there. I just want to go back to quarterback real quick. Even with Drew Aller shedding some weight and, trimming up, he's still about 30 pounds heavier than any other quarterback in that entire room. I know he's a few inches taller than them as well, but again, there's such a contrast, and that's why the expectations have always been so high with Drew Aller is the prototypical look, the create a quarterback look. And now you're talking about a guy who's maybe gotten rid of some of the baby fat or baby weight and is a little more well-equipped to carry the ball and kind of strike a little more balance within this offense, makes the defense think a little bit more pre-snap. And so we'll find out what the physical development means for Drew Aller, but it's something that I think we've really been hearing about going back to last winter workouts, about them trying to reposition him into a position, not only where he's just going to be leaner, healthier, but where he can represent more of a threat with the ball in his hands. Are they going to treat him like Trace McSorley? No. But I think that it's very important for this offense and for Kotelnicki, if they want to accomplish and they want to reach the kind of ceiling that they believe they can get to, that Drew Aller is going to need to pose a threat. And so this work was meant to do that. Over on defense, you mentioned, we'll talk about
I've got a Kaytron Allen point to make. I mean, in his freshman year, he was down to 201 pounds on the roster, that fall, and he was still playing the same way that he was, last year when he was in the 220s, at least to my view. So, I saw some conversation on the internet about what does that mean with Nick being more than Kaytron, and I think that Nick's kind of always been built. Singleton's always been built in kind of that same way. He came in really well developed. With Kaytron Allen, they had to do a little bit of more development, even though he did come out of IMG. But so I saw is Singleton the new power back? And it's like, no, I don't think anything's going to change with their roles. I mean, Allen lost so much weight that first year, and was still lowering his shoulder, still going through guys, still between the tackles. So that was just my 2 cents on that one.
Didn't we already establish that 6'5", 235-pound Drew Aller is the power back this year? I mean, come on.
Exactly.
Let's go to defense. We will talk about freshmen at large because there are several notable developments to get to from that class. But what stood out to you defensively? It's a group that returns a lot of veteran talent, and there's a lot of familiar names in that defensive line group that we have seen kind of go through those battles and trying to gain weight or trying to lose weight. And I've noted this in our practice report at different times during preseason camp. That defensive tackle unit in particular, I mean, you don't have to tell me what the roster says. I can see with my own eyes. These are guys that have been practicing with the team for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. It's a big group. They have the beef in the middle of this defensive line.
Yeah, I think seeing Hakeem Beamon at 296 is something that stands out to you. I think that he was like 256 a couple years ago at one point. And you look at him, we saw him around this summer a decent amount, and you can see that he has bulked up. He looks good. I think we're all still kind of waiting for that big Hakeem Beamon breakout that it feels like we've been hearing about for these past couple of seasons. But I think that physically he looks like he can hold up really well in the middle of a Big Ten defensive line. Alonzo Ford was unchanged at 319, but I think having someone that big, Caleb Artis is at 325. The last couple of years since the 1 year since PJ Mustipher left Penn State, didn't really seem to have that space eater in the middle. And I think that we'll see what Tom Allen wants to do, but it does seem like that Penn State has people that can maybe fill that role a little bit. But I think Beamon was the one that stood out to me. And then the rest of the guys holding steady, maybe dropping a little bit. I think that that's what you want to see. I talked about it, that there's always some settling as you go through camp. But it seems like they're in a good shape when you think about almost 2 years ago when we're at Michigan Stadium and James Franklin is talking about wanting to get bigger. I think that they have gotten bigger, and I think that we can see it with the naked eye when we look at these teams. Also on the defensive line, I thought Mason Robinson tipping up over 250. I thought that was notable. He's someone that we've heard a little bit about from James Franklin as potentially needing to step up. I thought that was a notable one because with some of these defensive ends, you don't exactly know how big they need to be. Like Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac were playing in the 240s earlier in their careers. I think they're up over 250 last year. It's very dependent, I think, on the type of player you are, type of body type, that sort of thing. But to see Mason Robinson bulking up as a redshirt freshman to potentially need to hold up, I thought was notable. So I think Beeman and Robinson were two that stood out to me. Tony Rojas, I think this might have been the first roster update that there's been since he enrolled where he lost weight. He was down to 236 from 239. And I think that those linebackers across the board, all the returning ones, and even some of the guys who enrolled earlier this year, it was a very steady across the board thing. Keon Wiley had the biggest gains. We haven't seen him on the practice field. We'll see what that looks like, what that means for him down the road if he does come back this season. But I thought seeing Kobe King, Tony Rojas, Tyler Elsdon, Dominic DeLuca kind of honed in, steady, locked in on where they're going to play after these guys had some gains. It did seem like the linebacker group got a little bit bigger earlier in the offseason after Tom Allen took over. To kind of see this honed in on, locked in on, I thought was notable too.
I'll just say at linebacker, I mean, the two lead guys we expect to see the most of, Rojas and Kobe King, they are about like maxed out, like in terms of what you want. I think they're both in like kind of the perfect spot. I know Kobe King, a lot of people felt like he was maxed out last year. He's on that pescatarian diet where he's only eating fish. Basically, what kind of James Franklin phrased it as, kind of battling Mother Nature to stay in this weight realm and be able to be a highly effective linebacker with the speed that's necessary. And, here he is at 248 down from 251. These guys are ready to roll. By the way, Dom DeLuca up to 230 pounds, same as Tyler Elsdon. I think we've always kind of viewed him as more of a lighter, a linebacker than what he has become, and really filled out physically. Expecting to see a lot of him as really the third most active linebacker in this group. I want to just go back to defensive tackle because you brought up the big bodies that are in place there, and Hakeem Beamon has certainly asserted himself as one of them, flirting with 300 pounds now legitimately. But you got Zane Durant right around 290 pounds. He was playing as a freshman a couple of years ago, probably at 265, 270 pounds. You've got Caleb Artis now at 325 pounds as a redshirt sophomore. Devontae Thomas is still over 300 pounds. Xavier Gilliam, one of those freshmen you just brought to campus this year, he's over 300 pounds. Keziah Izzard is 305 pounds. And I think you made a great point that there were years where they had a lot of athleticism and a lot of the developmental bodies, but not a lot of just take up space and deliver the bulk and hold the line kind of bodies. And right now it feels like they certainly have what they're looking for there. And I will just go back to what you said about Alonzo Ford being 319 and holding steady at 319. And he's somebody that we've heard is really going to play a role against the run this year initially and maybe grow off of that. But he was about 290 pounds, so 30 pounds lighter when he was last playing college football. He was a starter for Old Dominion in 2022 before he suffered a knee injury after transferring here, or I should say suffered an injury here after transferring in. And now here he is, 30 pounds heavier. You might think, well, guy's coming off an injury. He's that much heavier. Does this look messy? Does it look sloppy? Is it working? And consistently, we have heard that he is using it to his advantage. And all of a sudden, that defensive tackle group, which we thought was deep and ascending in terms of physicality, it just adds another kind of layer to that conversation. And anywhere else we need to go defensively, or have we kind of covered the ground we needed to?
Nah, I'm ready to talk about these freshmen.
All right. Well, there's one more I want to get to because he kind of feels like a freshman reset. Dakari Nelson. He's over 220 pounds now. He's at 222. Which is 5 pounds heavier than where he was in the preseason camp roster. And remember, he made that move from safety to linebacker midway through preseason camp, former top 24/7 prospect. They think very highly of them. It sounds like he's really taken to the linebacker position, fired up about it. Somebody I think to file away defensively for later in the season, but that's a really fun developmental piece of the process for Penn State's defense here under Tom Allen. And he's up over 220 pounds now as he really gets to let Mother Nature do its thing and try instead of trying to resist it and stay at safety. Getting to the safety or getting to the freshman now, Daniel, we'll talk about some green light news that came out on Monday, and James Franklin saying a couple freshmen will definitely burn red shirt this year. But as we work our way through progress for this group, an easy way to do that often is the roster updates, because we're not getting a lot of long looks at these guys during practice. Some of them we haven't really seen much of at all, but these roster updates reflect the kind of the quiet work happening behind the scenes. And so what were your biggest takeaways working your way through guys that have either been on campus since January or guys have, showed up to the scene this summer?
I think when you talk about guys who have been here since January, Quentin Martin is someone who I believe is up 20 pounds since he got here. I think that's a notable development when you talk about holding up, running inside, the different things that you can do, and holding up through the course of a long schedule. I think that's some of the subtext with some of these, with taking in some of these weights and some of this physical development, where it's not just 13 games or 14 games anymore. James Franklin has talked about it, that they have to be ready for potentially a 17 game season if you really max things out and play the maximum allotment of games. So I
saw someone push back against us on the last episode and said that there's only 4 postseason games at your disposal. I want to make note, the Big Ten championship game would be the 5th that we're alluding to. If Penn State were to get through, go to Indy and keep playing, you could play up to 17 games this year. So there's that. Just wanted to clarify for our listeners.
Yeah, it's some weird mechanics where you get there, you lose, then you're bumped out of that top 4, and then we'll see what happens. We'll see if anyone actually does that this fall. But I think that these guys are going to have to hold up through a long season. And I think some of the things that James Franklin talked about with how to use these red shirts in certain ways to have guys fresh, it's going to be interesting roster management. But Quentin Martin stood out to me. Corey Smith is up. Corey Smith was someone that James Franklin shouted out unprompted when talking about that third running back spot last week. So you like to see that. But the 2 guys on offense that my eyes went to first was Tysier Denmark at 187 pounds, up from 177. We know that he's kind of the prototypical slot receiver, a little bit on the smaller, slighter side. And that's something that kind of in your head, you're like, okay, how is that going to play going up against big safeties, potentially big linebackers, that sort of thing. So to see him be able to take to this program to bulk up a little bit, I think that stood out to me. I'm excited to see what this short area quickness that we saw in the 7-on-7 fields 2 years ago, to finally see that on the college field. Whenever, if that's against West Virginia, if that's later, I'm looking forward to seeing that. And then Luke Reynolds, someone that we've talked about a ton since he got to campus. He's listed at 248 pounds on the latest update. He was at 241 on the summer update. Ty Howell said that he was 214 or 216 pounds when he got here in January. It looks like he has some of that athleticism still. It looks like the way that he moves, it looks really, really natural. I think that's really interesting to follow. James Franklin has said that Luke Reynolds is going to play. Doesn't know how much. He's not a green light, but we're going to see him on the field a lot. So I think those are the ones that stood out to me. And then on the offensive line, Donnie Harbor was down a little bit. That for him coming in, that's, I think, finding his level a little bit. And then Caleb Brewer has made some gains up to 288 pounds. Those 2 guys are probably a little bit more down the road to contribute, but it's something that early on, it's the kind of the easiest progress report we can get.
Yeah, Brewer and Harbor were among summer enrollees on the offensive line, both of them focused on guard, something that my eyes went right to because I'm always curious with him these days. Egan Boyer, who we were told came to campus in January at 238 pounds, 6'8" offensive tackle, now listed at 280 pounds. That's 42 pounds added in fewer than 8 full months here as a Nittany Lion. And he's a guy that, again, his work will come on the practice field. But when you talk about what Phil Troutwine is cultivating in terms of developmental depth beyond the 2 deep right now, it's really at a different level than what I think we've seen from the Nittany Lions. So we got some freshman feedback there, and then we got more of that from James Franklin as well. on Monday as he, put out in the public forum the two names that he says have the green light right now from that freshman class. And the green light, that terminology is used by Franklin and his staff on an annual basis, basically meaning we're not keeping an eye on those 4 games. We're not worried about your red shirt. You're going into the season. You're going to play as much as we need you, and you're going to be a sophomore next year. And so the two to get that are Cooper Cousins, which should surprise absolutely no one if you have listened to any of this podcast this summer and really going before or followed our coverage. And then the other, which I think stands out more because he was a summer enrollee, is Dejon Lane. Because we've heard Dejon. I've heard it from different people on Penn State staff. Even we have a pronunciation guide that's now been put out by Penn State, and it's directing us toward Dejon. Is that you're vouching for me, right?
I went Dejon.
Dejon. Okay, well, yeah. One of us will get it off. Let's go Dejon. Because Dejon.
We'll ask him next year when we're finally allowed to talk to him.
He came up from Baltimore. He was a long pursued 4-star prospect. He's a guy that had a relatively quiet recruitment. So I think when you combine the quiet nature of his recruitment process, the fact that he wasn't one of those early enrollees who got to get involved for winter workouts and spring ball, your ears perk up a little bit more hearing that name from James Franklin on this first Monday of game week than you do hearing Cooper Cousins, which is kind of like, well, yeah, duh.
Yeah, I mean, Cooper Cousins has been on this trajectory since summer 2022, probably when he was doing all those camps. But I think Lane, I don't know if it necessarily surprised me to hear that from James Franklin yesterday, given some of the things I heard from Justin Lustig earlier this offseason and kind of the way that other players were talking about him in the backfield. I think we do this every year where we talk about the early enrollees and we make such a big deal about it. And it is a really big deal. But Penn State, every year, there's always a couple guys that come in the summer. And so I feel like sometimes we're like, wow, how is it possible that this summer enrollee could put himself in position? But I think that it speaks to the type of player that Lane is. On Zoom this morning, KJ Winston was talking about the things that made Lane, or that got him to this point. And he said that first thing that stood out was his height. Lane's listed at 6'2". Winston thinks he's the tallest guy in the room. I think Zachy Wheatley might be a little taller.
Nelson was until about ago.
That's true. And then the speed. We know that Lane, during his senior year at the Gilman School in Baltimore, really put down some impressive track times. And that's something that is a good way to measure. It sounds like it's translating. That's always something that we'll see going from the track to the football field. It's a little bit different. But the combination of height and speed stood out to Winston, and then combine that with maturity and the ability to be coached. And that is something that KJ Winston said put Lane in this position. I thought that someone on our board made kind of the comparison between Winston and Lane that I thought was pretty good, that these are two guys that had pretty quiet recruitments, came in not necessarily with kind of all the fanfare. They're slightly under the radar, but they've come in, gone to work, made impressions, and then physically they're similar. Lane's listed at 6'2", 211. He was up 8 pounds on the latest roster update. Winston's at 6'2", 208, I believe. So I think that those two guys could have, we'll see on the field how their playing styles are, but there are some similarities from where we stand right now. But I thought that it was impressive to see Lane put himself in this position, and he's number 10 for everyone in their programs, and you'll see him. It sounds like on Saturday at West Virginia.
KJ Winston got that green light his freshman year too. He was a starter by his sophomore year, and now he's, as a junior, being projected as a first-round NFL draft pick potentially. And I got to give Alan Zamitis some credit here, because he told me last signing day in December of 2023, when the name Dejon Lane came up, he said, reminds me of KJ Winston. He went right there and he explained why. And for a lot of the same reasons you said, any comparisons to KJ Winston you'll take right now from any kind of freshman. He is one of 2 freshman safeties. Babu Torre is the other. And remember, this room added a couple cornerback transplants during the offseason too. Colin Dinkins made the move from cornerback. He's going to be a factor in that Lion package. And then Lamont Payne, who was a freshman last year at the cornerback spot, made the move during spring ball to safety. So we know the top 3 are there, but with some more names in the mix, and now Lane firmly in that mix, the conversation about who is next up becomes even more interesting. And I think the really important thing to note here, and you did with special teams coordinator Justin Lustig, we often forget when trying to project which of these players and which of these freshmen is going to make an immediate impact and get that green light. What's their offensive role going to be? What's their defensive role? Well, if you got a special teams role and you're consistent and you're effective, that's your most realistic path toward getting the green light in a lot of cases. And you think about those three defensive backs who burned their red shirt last year. It was King Mack, it was Elliott Washington, and it was Zion Tracy. None of those guys played significant defensive reps, unless it was a blowout or unless it was the Peach Bowl when starters had opted out. But what they did on a week-to-week basis was contribute on multiple coverage units for special teams. And so that's a really important step forward. I think as we're monitoring some of the other defensive backs in this freshman class, Torrey at safety, you got 3 cornerbacks in the freshman group as well. And those linebackers, especially Anthony Specca, keep an eye on special teams, maybe providing that pathway. And James Franklin said, these are just the 2 he's ready to put out right now. He said that list of green lights could be longer, come Sunday after they get through the West Virginia matchup. And he said it's a couple things. It's going to be how these guys perform when they get into game matchups and how they continue to perform on the practice field. But also, it's football. Guys are going to get hurt. Guys that you thought were going to be really good might not be as good as you thought they would be. And so whether it's performance or availability issues ahead of them on the depth chart, there can be opportunities for guys to work their way up and not just burn red shirt, but maybe take on a really important role for Penn State as the season progresses. So with that in mind, who are you most specifically keeping tabs on? I'm assuming you're going to go back to that freshman tight end you mentioned who put on about 30 pounds so far.
Definitely. Luke Reynolds is someone that definitely going to have an eye on. Like James Franklin talked about, he's going to play, doesn't know how much. You look at what's already in the room, and there isn't necessarily on paper a need for someone to really step in. There's not a hole there for Luke Reynolds to fill. But if he's good enough, we've seen it in the past that he'll play. They got through last year with Andrew Rapplier preserving his red shirt, but you had Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren at the top. The picture's a little bit different this year. Other guys, Quentin Martin is someone who James Franklin has talked about as well. That was the interesting dynamic with Corey Smith about potentially basically taking 8 games between them and then splitting it up and using them in similar roles. I think Tysier Denmark is someone to keep tabs on depending on how the wide receiver situation develops. And then over on the defensive side of the ball, I had Vabu Torre written down because, like you said, special teams is something you have to think about. Those guys you mentioned from last year, they were all on those coverage units. That's where they burn their red shirts pretty much outside of those appearances and blowouts. So, Vabu Torre, does that get him onto the field early? I assume we'll see Lane on those kick coverage teams, at least to start the year. I don't know if Antoine Belgrave Shorter, Kenny Wosley, and John Mitchell, if they would necessarily burn their red shirts that way, given that there are 6 guys ahead of them that have experience. And I think that you can preserve those, but maybe you ration one spot on a coverage team between a couple of those guys to give them experience and those sorts of things. But yeah, I think Specca is someone too. And then I think Jalen Harvey might be a little interesting depending on how the depth at defensive end goes. He was one that I didn't mention on talking about the roster update. He's down to 250 pounds. He was up as much as 266 over the winter. And I know some people were thinking, does that mean he might move inside at some point? Deion Barnes in June said that kind of like, they're fine with him at defensive end right now. And I think that however he's reshaping his body, we'll see. I mean, I think overall the depth situations at linebacker and defensive end will be interesting this season, given the injuries and dismissals there. So I do think that maybe you pay a little bit more attention to Specca and Harvey than maybe you would have if the deck was full at this point.
Yeah, we had a lot of the same names written down. I mean, Quentin Martin, to me, like Luke Reynolds, similar situations where they have established stars ahead of them, but there will be opportunities. And I just wonder, given the physical development each have had, the versatility that I think they both bring to the field, because Luke Reynolds is really a dynamic threat for contested catches, and he's a guy who can just be a heck of a receiving talent. I don't know where he'll be as a blocker going into Big Ten play, but Tysier Denmark is the one that it feels like by necessity is going to have his name called Quentin Martin and Luke Reynolds, maybe as we sit here now, considering Cam Wallace, what he did with RB3, feel like luxury pieces of the roster. As we sit here, that could change in a hurry. But with Tyser Denmark, it doesn't feel like a luxury. It seems like, James Franklin bringing him into the conversation again yesterday as he's working his way through wide receivers and saying, and Tyser Denmark is part of this. Now, I know he'll be down in Morgantown. I don't have any doubts he's going to be on the travel squad. What I do wonder is he a guy that's going to get involved by design? Because that's what Marcus Hagans, Andy Kotelnicki, and James Franklin determined is the best move for him in game one. Or is he somebody that's going to be waiting in the wings, and however this game unfolds and what maybe happens at wide receiver will determine whether he gets to sniff the field? Either of those approaches are probably okay. But I think when it comes to who's going to have a consistent piece of the pie in this Penn State offensive plan by the end of September, I'm a hard lean more towards Tyser Denmark than I am about Quentin Martin and Luke Reynolds as things stand right now. But they all have the goods to help this team, especially could be nice little curveball kind of elements to this offensive attack if they do get in a situation later in the year where they can peel back the curtain a little bit without worrying about redshirt eligibility and unleash these guys with some design plays. But really a fun group. I'll just add one more that I think is worth mentioning. Max Granville. Now, he doesn't have the size that Jalen Harvey has right now. I think he's about 20 pounds lighter than Harvey, maybe 225 pounds, 230 pounds right now. He's supposed to be a high school senior until he reclassified in July. But it's the way that he's been described. I mentioned this last week going over the depth chart as him being a potential riser there, because the defensive end position isn't as deep as we thought it would be, and because Granville has been described as this guy who has this innate ability to disrupt the passing pocket. Those guys you tend to find a role for. I don't know if it's going to be necessary, but I think ultimately if he does it enough on the practice field where he's giving them fits and he's giving them a lot to think about, you'll open the door and you'll get him some game work. And whether that's 3 or 4 games and going off of that and seeing if it expands, I think there's just room for Max Granville, despite his lack of size right now, to maybe step up and get some run. But last year, 5 guys burned red shirt. Only 3 of them are still with the team. The year before, 10 players burned red shirt for Penn State. Now that 2022 class is really front and center in a lot of ways for this 2024 roster. Daniel, shifting away from the freshmen and towards some updates from Monday regarding Penn State's outlook for the opener. Caden Saunders is officially uncertain, I think we can call it. James Franklin said they're hopeful to get him back into action for this matchup, but he's been absent from practices for a bit. We don't exactly know for how long, but we know that he was not present when we were reviewing practice last Tuesday on August 20th. James Franklin noted that it's been missing from action for a little while here. And so there's a potential impact at the slot position, which is where we think him and Liam Clifford are going to handle the bulk of work. And maybe if Clifford's playing a lot more outside early in the year, then Caden Saunders is more the man to know at slot. But if he's unavailable, all of a sudden you're focusing a bit more on Tyser Denmark, maybe Anthony Ivy, a redshirt sophomore. But as I got to sitting down and writing this article yesterday about Saunders and his situation, I couldn't help but wonder what the impact might be at punt returner. Because you're talking about a hostile environment. We've heard that discussed time and time again. Season opener, and whether it's a first quarter punt that you're trying to field or a fourth quarter punt, things can go awry in a hurry for you if it doesn't go correctly. And one thing we heard about Caden Saunders, yes, he has explosive tendencies. He could potentially be a playmaker, but he's been so consistent in not losing them yards, not letting the ball hit the turf and then roll back 15 yards and you're setting your offense back by a first down or 2. Not making the mistake of going after poison balls and putting in a situation where you're going to have a turnover on special teams. And so with Caden Saunders absent, if that's the way it turns out on Saturday, we've heard Jaylen Reed mentioned as like a veteran presence who could step up. They've got younger guys they're working with, but that's a realistic concern for me that I didn't think would be any kind of talking point going into the game. Whereas who's going to be back there deep? How are they going to react to the moment? And, I know Daquan Hardy surprised everybody in a very positive way last year, but that is a rarity. I think more often than not, you see in college football, when a player kind of gets thrust into that punt return situation, it's not their normal job. It's not the tasks that they've done in games. You can see some missteps occur every Saturday across the sport. And so I think all of a sudden I'm more attentive to that potential for Penn State going into this matchup.
Like you mentioned when talking about guys burning their red shirt, special teams is the one that can fly a little bit under the radar until suddenly it's not, until suddenly you lose 20 yards on a punt or even turn the ball over. Last week when I talked to Justin Lustig, he was very complimentary of Caden Saunders, both for his ability to catch the ball and also to be explosive. He didn't really offer too much in terms of other names. Me and a couple other reporters trying to, I think, dig down a little bit and get maybe a little bit of a depth chart. But Jaylen Reed was the other name that he mentioned. I think that that's really interesting and a little intriguing to me. We've seen Jaylen Reed uh, at that safety spot, and we know that he has the athleticism and the skill set to, uh, you know, cover tight ends, cover running backs, sometimes cover wide receivers. But it'll be interesting. It would be interesting to see him in this type of environment. So that's something that we'll see. I mean, maybe we'll get some answers on Wednesday in terms of talking to players, talking to James Franklin, maybe seeing anything. But yeah, we'll see how this looks and how this shakes out on Saturday. But it's definitely I think more of a low key storyline, that a low key question that we definitely have on our minds.
And I did a little bit of digging. I went back to the media day comments from Justin Lustig, and this was just 2 preseason practices into the whole process in August. So it's a little dated, but we have heard Jaylen Reed's name pop up more recently at punt returner. The names he mentioned there that were working behind Caden Saunders, who he called the clear leader at punt returner: Quentin Martin, Anthony Ivy, Tyseer Denmark, Josiah Brown. I believe Anthony Ivy has checked in for 1 college game, maybe on special teams. No one else has played in a college game. So again, if those are some of the names that we're also talking about, a freshman, an inexperienced player, again, these are potential landmine spots for you on the road and what could be a tricky environment at West Virginia. So we will be back on the practice field on Wednesday evening, along with our regular dose of practice notes and observations. What really becomes key here during the season is who is maybe not out there when we're watching practice. And you can't always just rule a guy out for the upcoming game because we don't get him for our 20-minute window, but it can be an indication of how things may be trending. So best believe number 7, Caden Saunders, will be a guy that we're trying to find on the field on Wednesday when we get back out there. That receiver group in general got about as much of an endorsement as I've heard from James Franklin in the past couple of years, Daniel. I mean, he was asked directly on Monday, what is a position group and area of this roster that you saw make major strides during preseason, the most strides on this roster? And the first thing he brought up, and I know it might have pained him to do it because I think he doesn't like to talk about them very much. He wants them to prove it, but he said wide receiver. He also mentioned offensive line and quarterback, and quarterback one is interesting because it's the same top 2 guys in that room. But to hear him say receiver right away, and then give us more names than just Harrison Wallace and Liam Clifford by the end of that answer, kind of summarize what you heard from James Franklin and what it means to you.
It's definitely the most names that we've heard from James Franklin in response to a general question about the wide receivers. Everything this fall or this summer has been Trey Wallace and Liam Clifford and Trey Wallace.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of where you've started. Last week, we got a little bit more with Julian Fleming and Omari Evans popping up in conversation from Franklin as he went down the depth chart a little bit more. And then on Monday, he goes even further down where you've got mentions of Tyler Johnson, Anthony Ivy, and Mekhi Flowers. We talk a lot about the class of 2022 and the headliners, the guys that are going to be in the center of it all this year. And then you've got these 3 members of that class who have been really behind the scenes. Flowers has had some injury issues and position change. Johnson, I believe, was unavailable for every game last year on that pregame availability report. And then Ivy is someone that we've gotten a little bit of a look at, but only in the scout team environment or only in the practice environment. So those are 3 guys that I think that you talk about a program, everyone is on different timelines. Everyone goes through things differently. But by year 3, you hope that guys can start to get things in the gear, start to find their role a little bit, figure out what they can do well, and maybe things will click a little bit. Franklin did couch that by saying, doesn't know if it's going to be Saturday. Doesn't know if this is going to be a game 1 thing where you can roll out and go 7 or 8 deep at wide receiver. But the hope, and I kind of read this a little bit as a maybe the slight challenge from Franklin that he puts out there sometimes. He said that by game 4, by game 5, you get more of these guys in positions to contribute, more in the mix. I think Tysier Denmark falls into this category too a little bit, and kind of go from there, see what you can get. But I thought it was interesting. I mean, those are 3 guys that even on this podcast where we get pretty nuanced, pretty into the nitty gritty, Johnson and Ivy haven't really come up in conversation. Flowers came up because he was a news item this offseason with a position change. I talked to him at media day, seems pretty confident. He feels like he's back. He thinks he can bring a lot to that wide receiver room. We know that he was an athlete in high school in the Harrisburg area. He was a big time playmaker on a state championship team. And he still has those instincts. He thinks so. We'll see what that looks like for him. But I thought it was interesting. That was the one thing. I think I was busy putting something on the board or organizing some notes on another answer, and I was a little zoned out. But suddenly I heard those 3 names, and it really brought me back to Franklin, because it's not something that we've heard from him in a while.
All 3 of those dudes put up fantastic numbers at the high school level. That was 3 years ago, though, high school senior season. And then you talk about the 2 other year 3 wide receivers, Caden Saunders right now. We'll see what his availability looks like. And then Omari Evans, we certainly have him penciled in right now as one of the top 4 or 5 receivers. But 5 guys representing that class, with Christian Driver, by the way, moving on to Minnesota last offseason. So when we look at this group collectively, Daniel, and we talk about the receiver group, it's a competition that will be ongoing, like you said. They've got Bowling Green and Kent State, and then a bye week sandwiched in between before you start to get into your Big Ten play. So I think there should be opportunities those couple weeks. I could see them really leaning heavily on 4 or 5 receivers this Saturday at West Virginia. But you'd think, based on game flow, that those next couple games at home, you can maybe empty the sideline a little bit, get those guys some run, because the clock's really ticking on these dudes to be in year 3 and not to really have anything to point to. And I know Flowers has a position change and Tyler Johnson has an injury thing, but it gets a little scary when your eligibility clock is ticking like that. You're in year 3, and if you don't have a foreseeable on-field role, it can get a little stressful. So we'll see if these guys can maximize their September. And because it feels like once this team gets into Big Ten action, they're going to know exactly what the plan is at every single position. And so we'll see if some young players can assert themselves. James Franklin says he wants like a 2.5 deep, at wide receiver. I think right now we're having a hard time counting to 6 guys that we think will definitely be out there playing consistently against West Virginia. But Julian Fleming, Harrison Wallace, Omari Evans, Liam Clifford, those have been the names, along with Caden Saunders, that have kind of been towards the front. Saunders we're still waiting on. And then there's this group below that are either inexperienced or new to the program, like a Tysier Denmark. Other competitions that we're keeping tabs on, right tackle, place kicker, both of these spots came up on Monday. Didn't get an answer one way or the other. James Franklin said all 3 of those place kickers are still involved. Mentioned that it's very narrowly contested right now in terms of the percentage points of their misses that are charted over the course of this entire preseason camp and in the entire year. What we had heard most recently was that Sanders Sahadak and Ryan Barker maybe had a bit of an edge over the newcomer, the transfer from Tulsa, Chase Meyer. We'll get a look, and it'll be a hell of a story if it is Sanders Sahadak. And we've heard James Franklin lean into, game experience could play a role in this decision, guys who have done it before. And the only guy who fits that bill in a Penn State uniform is Sahadak. And unfortunately for him, it was like a house of horrors last year where he got 1/2 of action, then got benched in the season opener and watched Alex Felkins handle the place kicker role the rest of the way. But that would be a really interesting redemption opportunity if Sahadak is the pick on Saturday. I think we got a little more interesting intel at the right tackle spot and really reinforcing what we've been anticipating all preseason, Daniel. We're going to see both of those guys play on Saturday. Nolan Rucci, redshirt junior out of Wisconsin, has done some good things from a physical standpoint this year, really taken to Phil Troutwine's coaching as well. And then Anthony Donko, who finished with such a high note last year, playing right tackle, second half of the Peach Bowl, one of the more physically impressive players on this team as a redshirt freshman, and a guy who's really far ahead of his age in terms of mental awareness at that spot as well. And I don't read into this as being a bad thing. I know some people will say, well, if you got two, you don't have one, right? And that's the quarterback conversation. I think it's a little different here. I think Nolan Rucci and Anthony Donka have played so little meaningful football in college games that you owe it to them and you owe it to yourself as a coaching staff to see what does it look like when the lights come on. Because look, if it doesn't work out for one of these guys and it's ugly, then you know what? He's not going to play as much the rest of the way. But if you got these guys out and it looks like the light's coming on for both of them, then it really does well for you to maintain that competition as long as you can. And we know that Andy Kotelnicki in the past at Kansas has brought in jumbo sets and an extra offensive tackle. So Nolan Rucci in November against Ohio State as a sixth offensive lineman is going to be more valuable to you if he's coming in after accruing 150 to 200 snaps in the first 2 months of the season versus coming in cold as a complete bench player. And so I don't view this as, oh, they can't find a starter because neither of these guys are looking like a starter. I'm viewing it as more of they want to give both these guys a chance to show what they're about against an opponent. They'll reevaluate on a weekly basis. But I think there's generally a real feeling of confidence that between Rucci, between Donka, they're going to be able to firm things up on the right side. And I know everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth, and that's kind of the philosophy here at tackle. We've been saying we feel like they can overcome the loss of Caden Wallace and Olu Fashanu, but let me reinforce this. The play they got from their bookend tackles last year was about as good as Penn State has gotten from a pair of offensive tackles in recent memory. And you talk to the Mark Brennans of the world, they'll go back a little bit longer than recent memory. So those are some big shoes to fill. I have to make note of that.
I think when you talk about the offensive line in this right tackle situation, Phil Trautwein has compiled a bunch of equity in terms of he's gotten that benefit of the doubt at this point. At this time, 2 years ago, he did not have that. He had to prove it. James Franklin wasn't talking about these offensive linemen. I think the job that he's done these past couple of years, the development we've seen from guys like Caden Wallace, I think that going into this and having this sort of situation, I think that you kind of let them do what they feel they need to do. And we've seen it, that they're not afraid to have a quick hook or to make a change when they feel they need to. In that Purdue game 2 years ago, it was Bryce Hefner coming into the game with 5 minutes left at right tackle for Caden Wallace. They'll know what they need to do, but I think that this is what they do on this line. You rotate guys through. This is kind of an established precedent at this point. Something else too is that some of these position battles really can only be settled in a game. You try to simulate it in practice. You try to do everything you can, but like you said, it's different when the lights come on. And the way that Penn State's schedule has been structured these past couple of years, you don't ease into things with the 3 non-con games. It's just been off the jump, the 4 years that I've been on this beat with Wisconsin, Purdue, and now 2 years in a row with West Virginia. So there is a little uncertainty. There is a little bit of risk there. You don't have those 3 patsies where you can really work through everything and really try these different combinations in a lower stakes situation. So that's just kind of the nature of the beast right now. But this is something where for me, if you have 2 at right tackle, I think you can still have 1, just as long as James Franklin doesn't call it a good problem to have, because I don't think any of those exist.
Yeah, we'll find out a lot more about Nolan Rucci and Anthony Donka in just about 4 days, less than that now as we record at 1:30 on Tuesday, less than 4 days from kickoff now for this Penn State season. Wanted to finish with a big Penn State news that surfaced on Monday, but not really specific to football, although it did come up at the very start of James Franklin's press conference. Pat Kraft, a couple years after coming to campus as the new athletic director for Penn State, he's sticking around for a while, gets a major contract extension, more than $2 million per year on average through 2032. Daniel, you had the story up at Lions247.com. We'll get into James Franklin reaction in just a moment, what this move means to him. But, man, this is quite the financial investment for Penn State into the leader of their athletics department.
Definitely. I went back to the story, actually one of the first stories I wrote for Lions247 back in April 2022, and looked at what Pat Kraft's annual salary was then, 1.33, a little bit less than $1.33 million per year, plus a potential $250K in bonuses. Now $2.26 million per year and $350K in potential performance-based bonuses. So it's an investment. It's a sign that they want to keep Pat Kraft around. I saw Ben Jones make a note that the contracts for Pat Kraft and James Franklin are now basically synced up in terms of when they expire in 2032. So these are two guys that are, I think, pretty tied at the hip, and which it usually is. James Franklin talks about the alignment all the time and about how, since Pat Kraft has come in and since Neely Bendapudi became president, that he feels that alignment up and down the athletic department and the administration. And I think that this is that sign where you have these two men really locked into these two really important positions that work a lot together for these next couple of years. So it's interesting. I think that anytime you get into the administration realm, these jobs at this point are so complicated. I think Pat Kraft is probably, maybe becoming the last of a breed where he's a former football player, former athlete. I know that he came up on the admin side as opposed to in the past when you'd have guys come up on the coaching side. But I think at Notre Dame, the athletic director is going to be an NBC executive or former NBC staffer. Like, there's a lot more on the business side now. We see it that they're getting these donations for the Beaver Stadium project that Pat Kraft is overseeing. It's just such a wide-ranging job at this point. And I think that if you're a school at Penn State status and where Penn State wants to be, you want to have stability there. You want to lock in your guy there. And it appears the Board of Trustees and the administration did just that.
This was the third straight week. News surfaced before we recorded here on Tuesday. Third straight week that Penn State secures an 8-figure founder's gift for its Beaver Stadium renovations. What was the big $30 million a couple weeks ago?
25.
25 million, and then now a couple consecutive 10 million gift announcements. And so obviously this is a massive, approaching $1 billion renovation. So huge news for the Nittany Lions community. And I was thinking about this while we were setting up the record today, and I'm just like, what does Pat Kraft's day-to-day look like? Because we are so fixated on football, and many people are fixated on football. But if there's a fire to put out for any sport, he's going to maybe be getting that phone call. You've got all the NIL complications, which, again, we're fixated on football. Every athlete on this campus has technically an NIL opportunity. So you're trying to facilitate all those things, not to mention making sure your staff feels good, firing the staff that's not doing the good job for you, rewarding the staff that's doing a great job. And there's all the other off-field stuff that can pop up when you least expect it. So I don't know if anyone can ever say it's that's a job that you should be getting paid $2.3 million to do. But that's what the market is dictating right now. And Pat Kraft clearly is considered, when you talk to people here at the university and really beyond, considered one of those premier figures in college athletics administration right now, and a guy who is kind of viewed as a stock up presence in those situations. And so it feels like it's been a while since he took over. It's only been about 2.5 years, but clearly a lot of buy-in right now. University president, the head football coach, and we'll get into that right now. James Franklin called him a fierce competitor, a guy that he feels like he's shared the foxhole with. And we know that they've gone through some interesting moments together. I think they were on their way to Las Vegas for Olu Fashion News Award ceremony last year. They're getting blown up by an NIL agent trying to peddle one of their own players. They've been through some interesting spots, needing to hire 3 new coordinators. You got to really rely on your athletic director to get to the finish line with those things, especially when you're doing it so stealth. But James Franklin certainly feels, and this is not to slight who was in that position before him, but that they have reached a new level of being on the same page and basically, in a lot of ways working in tandem on really important topics that are facing the college athletics community, and especially the football one right now.
Yeah, Franklin was really complimentary of Pat Kraft and the work that they've done together. It's like you said, it's such a wide, all-encompassing job, and with so many different teams and athletes and coaches to have relationships with. And I think that Franklin said that he's heard it from other coaches within the athletic department that they are happy with Pat Kraft, and that it sounded like within the department, the way that Franklin told it, that everyone was happy when they found out Monday morning at a meeting that Kraft was getting this extension. So we'll see. I mean, I think that a position like this, it's not something you can measure the impact in 2 years. I think that you really do need all the way to 2032 to get the full scope of the type of impact that someone like Pat Kraft can have. But I do think that James Franklin's words, whenever Franklin speaks about anything, everyone listens, everyone pays attention to it. And I think that does carry some weight in terms of how he feels about Pat Kraft and what that means moving forward.
And we will probably get a chance to hear from Pat Kraft eventually. He pops up with some media stuff here and there. But obviously, a nice day for the Kraft family and a bit of news there for the Penn State community. Daniel, you and I are back on the practice field tomorrow. We have another episode to get through here this week for the podcast. We'll give our predictions for this game and for the entire season. We'll talk about our MVP picks and breakout picks as well. But I think that's enough for now. We're going to turn our attention to West Virginia with Chris Anderson. Appreciate the perspective as always and enjoy reporting with you. We're in the thick of it now, my friend.
Thanks for having me, Tyler. It's good to be back in the thick of it.
As promised, this episode of the Lions247 Podcast continues with a closer look at Penn State's first opponent of the 2024 season. Nittany Lions will head down on Friday for a Saturday matchup in Morgantown against the West Virginia Mountaineers. And to learn more about WVU, how they fared during preseason camp, and what the expectations are going into their 2024 campaign, we welcome in Chris Anderson, Mountaineers insider within the 247 Sports Network. Chris, welcome back.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, it is game week. I know we had you on a couple months ago, and we were both in our respective corners trying to wrap our heads around the teams that we get paid to cover. And we just spent the last month breaking down Penn State's preseason progress. So I think that's probably the best way to start with you, Chris, is what did you really gain from your coverage of preseason camp and trying to get a good picture of what this West Virginia squad's all about?
That some of the places, I think the biggest way is that some of the position groups, the two main position groups that I had questions about, the coaching staff feels obscenely, in my opinion, confident about them, which seems notable to me because typically when these coaches get to talking about players or position groups, they are tempering expectations, moderating expectations. Very rarely has Neil Brown and his staff kind of jumped out and been like, "No, this kid that you don't know about is legit." They did it with Jaheim White last year, worked out. They did it with Beanie Bishop last year, worked out. They're doing a similar thing with some of the linebackers and some of the corners, which were my two biggest question marks on this team.
Sorry about that, a little mic issue on my end. But Chris, when we look at this team, I think last year a lot of people kind of remember how things went in that week one game here in Beaver Stadium. Penn State won pretty handily when it was all said and done. Neil Brown was considered to be, approaching the hot seat or already on the hot seat going into the season. But lo and behold, they end up winning 9 games. James Franklin talked about it yesterday in his press conference, said they really should have won that Houston game. It was a heartbreaking loss. And so they get through the end, and it felt like there was a much different sense around Neil Brown and the Mountaineers versus when we saw them in Beaver Stadium last year. Just what did Brown accomplish in 2023, and how does that kind of set him up for having a longer leash and maybe having more success here in 2024?
Yeah, I think steadying the ship is the best way to go about it because it was certainly rocky after some of what happened last year, an athletic director change, some discussion about NIL and funds and transfers and all of that stuff. And then it was, hey, here's Penn State. Were there expectations that West Virginia was going to win that game? No, I think most realistic people were not thinking that was going to happen, but it was still a measuring stick. You could still measure yourself against someone who is much better than you in that game. And that's, are you competitive? Is it close? Okay, can you make Penn State concerned? And I'm not sure they felt that way. I know they kept it close for a couple of quarters, but then it kind of ended up as a blowout, like you said. So I think things were on shaky ground there. And no one, I don't want to say no one cared over the next couple of weeks. It's an FCS opponent, and then they beat Pitt. Everybody loves beating Pitt, but everyone knew that Pitt team, especially after watching them, was terrible. So there was still, hey, what is this team? And I would say, honestly, that things were questionable even after that Houston loss. Again, not only the way they lost it, but the fact that Houston was a bad team and to the former coach, things were still ugly then, I would say. it wasn't until after that when West Virginia kind of strung together a few wins and ended the season strong that he really steadied the ship, got an extra 1-year extension, moved some money around, bought some more goods from the fans. Now I think they're kind of, oddly enough, back in the same spot. Here's another measuring stick game against Penn State to open the season.
Yeah, they're 9-4 last year. They won the Duke's Mayo Bowl to get that 9th win, finishing number 25 in that coaches poll. You go back to the track record for Brown leading up to that. He was 5-7 in year 1, 6-4 in year 2, which was the COVID shortened year, then 6-7, then 5-7. And so pretty significant step forward last year. They do have the same guy at quarterback that we got a chance to see last year in Garrett Green. I know as the season went on, seems like they really dictated terms differently on offense and what they wanted to do and kind of catering to his strengths and maybe going away from some of his potential weaknesses. So now that he is kind of settled in, I think it's fair to say as a trigger man for this offense. I know James Franklin has said they have a ton of respect for him. We've heard it from defenders in the Nittany Lions locker room that they really are preparing for a dual threat player who has some savviness to him. Just what is the confidence level in QB1 down in Morgantown?
So his confidence in himself is sky high. I can tell you that, which is what you want in a quarterback. And I think from the coaching staff, they're confident in too. Last year, again, the approach was, and Neil Brown said this openly, especially about halfway through the season, was, hey, Green's going to complete 50% of his passes, whether he throws it 2 yards or 30 yards. So we might as well just chuck it 30 yards. And that explained their approach was they would run, and chuck it downfield and hope. And it worked. They ended up with a top 5 offense, I believe the best rushing offense in Power 4 football. And Green had one of the best kind of, what is the stat? Like yards in air per attempt and still didn't turn the ball over much. So it was an offense that could put up some big plays, chew up some clock, and put points on the board. And it helped them win, like you said, 9 games. So confidence in him is high, and they are hoping to further develop his passing game. I mean, again, it's still run first, run second in Morgantown. Don't get me wrong. That's not changing. But they're hoping that when they get into those passing situations, there can be a little more nuance to it. There can be a little more variety because the better teams are going to be able to figure out how to stop it if the only thing you can do is chuck it deep.
Green's not the biggest guy. I think he's listed 6 foot, sub 210 pounds, maybe 5'11", sub 200.
Very generous.
But yeah, he goes for 700 rushing yards last year, over 6 yards per carry on average, 13 touchdowns as a runner. That goes with his passing year as well, 2,100 passing yards, 15 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 53% completion rating. You talked about the ability for this team to really establish itself on the ground, and I know that they feel heavily about doing that with their tandem at running back. What's the scouting report on the lead duo in the backfield for the West Virginia Mountaineers and how they complement each other?
Yeah, still Jaheim White and CJ Donaldson. White is the smaller one. He's the Thunder and Lightning thing. I don't know if it really fits, but I guess if we're going that direction, Thunder is CJ Donaldson, Jaheim White is the Lightning. He is quick. He is to the point. Probably 5'8", and again 180. And then CJ Donaldson is a bigger guy, a converted tight end, as everybody knows, about 6'1", 6'2", 220 pounds. Likes to run between the tackles. Sometimes last year, I think, after he got hurt the season before, a little more hesitant about hitting those holes. But once he got going again, he looked a little bit more like his old self. And I think maybe even part of that was the fact that White was kind of breathing down his neck and taking some of his carries as well, because White just kind of burst onto the scene and took it over. And so I think by year's end, it was a nice blend between the two. 3 if you count Green. And I think that's still going to be the approach for West Virginia moving forward.
When Green does, as you said, look deep, chuck it deep, whatever you want to call it, who are the playmakers downfield? And what can you tell us about this Mountaineers offensive line?
Wide receiver is going to be deep, but curious. I guess we're waiting to see who's going to step up here. West Virginia is going to return 4 of their top 5 receivers from last year, their top 3 receivers and top tight end. But then they also brought in Jaden Bray from Oklahoma State and Justin Robinson from Mississippi State. And the expectation is that those 2 will push for and get playing time. Traylon Ray took on a bigger role towards the end of the year, started off the Duke's Mayo Bowl with a 75-yard touchdown. Hudson Clement had a breakout game against Duquesne 3 touchdowns, a couple hundred yards receiving, got a scholarship after that game. He is kind of a deep threat. Preston Fox has had some big moments. So I think that's where your focus is between those guys, especially on the outside. How it's all going to split, I don't know. As of the moment we're doing this, no depth chart from West Virginia. No surprise there. That's something they're avoiding doing lately. But when they did send one out with the media guide in the summer, lots of or, or, or at the receivers, and I don't expect that to change.
Yeah, we don't have a depth chart either. That's per tradition here in Happy Valley as well, and we just put out our depth chart with some oars involved in that mix as well. We'll find out a lot, both of us, on Saturday when these teams actually get out on the field. Defensively, this was a team that was kind of ranked middle of the pack in the Big 12 last year. Last year, when we got to look at them, Drew Aller had far and away his most productive and efficient passing performance of the whole season, as it turned out, in the season opener against West Virginia. So what do we make of the Mountaineers defense? Is it a group that you saw getting better in 2023? And is there momentum in place right now, or is there a fresh start in some areas?
I say it was a flawed defense last year. Has a few guys that stood out, but lacked some depth in some spots, flawed in others. And I think it's going to be similar this year. I think the big issue West Virginia had last year at Penn State, and the coaching staff admitted it after the game and throughout the year, and again this month, is that they fully game planned to stop the run. They said Drew Aller can't beat us. Let's stop the run. No, Drew Aller beat him, and he played extremely well. And so I don't think it was the wrong approach. I think that's the right thing. Hey, take away that running game. It's lethal, especially at the start of the year. You can't do that. And it just backfired on them. And so now I think they have to come with a little bit more of a balanced look against Penn State. But then you're just still picking your poison because you still got the same potent running game and you still got Drew Aller quarterback. So I don't know if you can really sell out to try to stop the run again. But if you had to pick one of the two, honestly, I think you want Aller to try to beat you instead of let the run game just pound you to death.
Now, Aller, when we closed our laptops that Saturday night after the season opener in 2023, felt like everything was right on track for him. Former number one quarterback recruit, 300 plus yards, a few touchdowns, prime time, week one. Now, as the season progressed, the warts became more apparent in some big matchups. Penn State ends up firing their offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach. And so Drew Aller, going into his second year as a starter, as a junior at the college level, around here, people are really curious about who he is, what he's going to be. What is the thought about Aller down in West Virginia? How much respect have you maybe heard? And maybe how many people out there think that he could be a potential, Achilles heel in this matchup if it doesn't come together? Because it sounded like you said leaning towards stopping that defense versus, putting your eggs in the basket with Aller. How is he viewed down there? Because we talk about him so much in our small bubble lens. I'm wondering what the opposition thinks.
Yeah, if you ask my message board, they want to go with the same game plan as last year, and they think it'll be different. And maybe it will. I think they, just like you said, they view Aller as potentially the Achilles heel, especially with a lot of changes on that offensive line there in Happy Valley. And maybe they get to him without sacrificing their run defense. Maybe they can affect him and get him off his game without having to put too many defensive resources towards stopping the passing game. And, when it comes to somebody like that, like the arm talent and the physical talent, the attributes, that's something that, a West Virginia team looks at and goes, holy cow, why can't we get a quarterback like that? But they do the warts, like you said, especially as the season went along. And I think they want to attack him again.
When it comes to attacking, who are the potential momentum swingers on this West Virginia defense? You said expect it to still carry some flaws, but there are some players who can maybe swing that pendulum when the action starts. Noon, Morgantown, Saturday. Drew Aller hits the field. Who do Nittany Lions fans need to be a bit wary about? Who could maybe blow up a player or two?
I'm watching very closely this new spur position. It was the bandit. It was something else before that, but West Virginia. When Jordan Leslie arrived, the defensive coordinator with Neil Brown, he wasn't defensive coordinator at the time, but is running the same defense as the guy who was when it started, Vic Koenig. And they said the spur or the bandit was the important position on the field. It was the most important position of that defense. And over the first, 5 years of the Neil Brown tenure, it's been, I don't want to say a non-factor, but certainly not a big factor. And this offseason, West Virginia went out, they lost their safeties coach, and instead of replacing with another safeties coach, they went out and hired a very specific edge rusher coach. They changed the terminology from bandit to spur. They talked about maybe using more than one on the field at the same time. And this is like a stand-up edge rusher that's going to get after the quarterback. And they got Tyron Bradley, who finished last season, and then they brought in Ty French, an FCS All-American who had, I believe it was 14 sacks last year. And I think they're coming in with a new approach to try to get some pressure off the edges of that, because they just haven't got the pressure on the quarterback from the defensive line or that old bandit position. So in my eyes, it's kind of a wild card spot of the spur and those two players and what West Virginia might do with it. That could be a difference maker for WVU on defense.
So you're also explaining this as something that Penn State is going to have to adjust and react to accordingly, because if you don't know it, someone who's down there covering the team, then Penn State, I'm sure, is trying to understand what the defense is going to do. So there's an element of surprise potentially here as well.
Yeah, I think that's the one tweak. A lot of the stuff for West Virginia, same offensive coordinator, same defensive coordinator, a lot of the same players. But this was the one little tweak, I think, in the offseason that West Virginia has made with personnel and the coaching staff. It's not quite having to try to figure out what Penn State's doing with a new offensive coordinator and a new defensive coordinator, but it could be a wrinkle, especially at least season opener.
I never want to overlook special teams on a weekly basis, but especially when it's week one. We're still waiting to find out who the place kicker is for Penn State. You saw kind of a revolving door occur there last year's opener with them benching their starter. And then the punt returner here, Caden Saunders, is someone who's may or may not be available to Penn State on Saturday. So I'm going to throw that ball in your court. What do we need to know about West Virginia's special team situation, the threats, maybe some weaknesses or storylines there? Because if this one is hanging in the balance late, special teams could make the impact.
West Virginia will return their starting punter, their starting kicker, their starting long snapper. That's the positive, because the punter was very good. He's an Australian punter that can kick with his right foot or his left foot, and they will kind of play call depending on where the rushes are coming from the opposing team's punt block unit. And they love to do that kind of slow rolling punt to give their guys time to go down the coverage. And it worked well. West Virginia's punt coverage is one of the best in the country, top 5 last I checked. Bad news, West Virginia still absolutely refuse to kick the ball on kickoffs into the end zone. And they ranked as one of the worst in the country. I believe it was 130th out of 133 teams in kickoff return defense. They were the only team in the country to allow 3 kickoff returns for touchdowns last year, and I believe the touchback percentage was 28%. When wow. You should be shooting for 60-70%. I think they try to get too cute too often, and that can hurt. I mean, starting field position is a major factor in these games, especially close ones. And West Virginia has seen over the years how a team can just maybe be struggling and then get one big special teams play, and it's over.
And Nick Singleton figures to be the man back deep, and he's got some juice. So that might be an interesting part of this matchup if they continue to elect to avoid the end zone when they're kicking off. What would you consider to be an X factor as we get closer to kickoff and you kind of try to figure out where West Virginia is going to have the edge, what they're going to have to make up, and some deficiencies? What's an X factor on West Virginia's side that you think, whether it goes one way or the other, could really make or break the chances to pull off an upset?
Can I cheat and say weather?
Of course.
No? Yeah, it hadn't even crossed my mind to check the weather, but I'm very curious how or if the teams will change their game plan, especially offensively, because right now it's looking like 70-80% chance of thunderstorms all day long. Hopefully we don't end up with one of those good old-fashioned lightning delays that extends everyone's day.
Please no.
4 hours to 10. But we have seen that. We saw it last year with Duquesne. We've seen it before in early season games in Morgantown. But I don't know how much of a factor it's going to be because both teams are more run-oriented. But I think the big X factor for me on West Virginia's side is, can this offensive line be as good as many people think it can be? Because, yes, they lost an All-American center who's going to start as a rookie in the NFL, and Zach Frazier. They lost Doug Nestor, who was an all-conference caliber player starting a right tackle, yet still returned 5 players that started 4 games and had over 400 snaps last year. So a total of 3,000 snaps coming back between 5 starters, and then added transfers on top of it. So the depth is still there. The talent should still be there. Can they kind of pick up where they left off with that offensive line last year? We'll see.
Let me ask about a couple of familiar names for our listeners out there, one of which started his career here, Fatorma Mulba, a guy who wowed a lot of people in the weight room, but never really got to put it all together on the field in that defensive tackle position. I know he's now in year 2, I think, with West Virginia.
Yep.
His last game was the Rose Bowl with Penn State. And then Rodney Gallagher, who was a long-term recruiting target here in the state of Pennsylvania from Western PA. He's closer to West Virginia's campus than he is to Happy Valley, but a lot of people were frustrated when he ended up picking WVU. He was a freshman last year. I know there had been some positional flexibility mentioned with him on both sides of the ball. So can you bring us up to speed on Mulba and Gallagher and their respective careers down there?
Let's go Mulba because that'll be shorter and easier. He averaged about 15, 25 snaps a game last year. It was excellent. He is expected to start this season. Again, a big X factor for me because was he excellent because he only had to play 25 snaps? Can he handle a bigger load? Or will West Virginia have to keep him to kind of that limit of 5, 6 drives per game and split reps with someone else? I think I'm very curious to see that, especially earlier in the season when the weather's hotter. Rodney Gallagher expected to be the starter at slot receiver when they have a slot receiver on the field. He will play all over the place. They threw out the idea back in the spring. He may play some slot corner as well. He's also a return man. And we kind of shrugged it off. Spring football shenanigans, and everybody's bored and talking about stuff. Fall camp, he's getting a couple reps on defense. They're talking about it a little more. There's some whispers about it. We'll see. That's so hard to do. I mean, the number of people that do that in reality and do it well, you could probably count on one hand in the last decade. And so I don't know if it's going to be a big thing, but we'll see. We'll know within a couple weeks for sure.
You got visual confirmation on the practice field, though, that he's working in the slot on both sides of the ball. So that's notable.
He's been out there.
That's interesting. Now let's finish with this one. West Virginia pulls off the upset, beats number 8 Penn State. If ... you fill in the blank, and then ultimately, are you ready to give us a prediction for this game? We're recording on a Tuesday. I'd understand if you're not quite there yet, but we'd love for you to declare it on the show if you're willing.
Yeah, I think if the linebackers live up to their potential, it's the biggest concern for me on this entire team. I'll try to give a very brief rundown of my extremely negative view of those 4 players that are in for those 2 spots. Because again, there's one way to look at it of, hey, there's this guy who was excellent in 4 games last year, another guy who's an NFL legacy who they were expecting to start, and so on and so forth. But the other way of looking at it is as there's a redshirt freshman coming off a devastating knee who missed all of last season, has never played a snap. That's Josiah Trotter. There's a true sophomore who played 4.5 games before getting hurt, being carted off the field, coming off a devastating knee injury, might start. A third, that was Trey Lathan. The third player is Ben Cutter, who would not have really played a lot of meaningful defensive snaps if not for those 2 injuries. And for whatever you think of Pro Football Focus, they had him ranked as the lowest rated regular defender on the team. He's a true sophomore. And then Reed Carrico, a transfer from Ohio State, who has not played a defensive snap in 3 years.
Wow.
Those are your 4 linebackers fighting for 2 spots. Now, that's an admittedly very negative review of it, and the coaching staff has been like, hey, this is as deep and as talented as we've been at this spot. But there's a world where things go bad. And this is an opponent they can go bad against. So if West Virginia has a chance to win this game, it's because those 4 or 2 of those 4 or 3 of those 4 live up to the lofty expectations that the coaching staff lay out for them.
And do you have a prediction for us?
I think it's going to be close. Because about a month ago, the line, I believe, was 12.5. We talked about it over on my podcast with Mike. And I said, there's no way. I mean, I'm betting West Virginia anything until it gets below 10. If it gets to plus 9.5, I might hesitate a little bit. But if you can get me under double digits, I'm betting West Virginia. It's now down to 8.5. So somebody with more money than me put money on WVU there. I think it's going to be close. I just don't know if the defense can slow down Penn State. I know that's not necessarily Penn State's strength, but I have so many questions on all three lines of the defense for West Virginia that I think this just might be too tough of a opening opponent for them.
Chris Anderson covers the West Virginia Mountaineers for 24/7 Sports. He's also kind enough to hop on with us during a game week to preview this matchup. We'll see what happens Saturday. I know I've got some work to do for something on your site now. I'll return the favor. But, Chris, thank you very much for hopping on with us and giving us some great perspective from Morgantown.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Lions247 Podcast. Hopefully this was a really good one to set the stage for you for the remainder of game week coverage at Lions247.com. We will be back on the practice field on Wednesday evening. We'll get another look at the Nittany Lions, getting important to see who's not available out there at practice as we get toward kickoff. We'll have all those notes for you in our weekly practice report coming up Wednesday evening, full photo gallery, video from the practice field. And when we wrap up that coverage of Penn State practice, we'll get a chance to speak with head coach James Franklin, a variety of players that'll include starting quarterback Drew Aller. So plenty more coming your way at the site. And then Thursday, we're back. This will be our normal Thursday slot during game weeks. We will do our predictions, not just for game one and the keys to the game for game one, but we're going to give you our predictions for season record over the entire 12-game regular season, our offensive and defensive MVP picks, and breakout players on both sides of the ball. So a ton of preview content coming your way later in the week. And then, of course, Saturday, when this one goes final and we wrap up our coverage of James Franklin's press conference and post-game player interviews, Daniel Gallen and myself will be with you for a post-game podcast, our first post-game podcast since the Peach Bowl down in Atlanta, and maybe if you count the blue-white game in April. But you know how it goes with that one. It's going to be immediate reaction and analysis to whatever transpires on the field there Saturday afternoon between these two squads. For now, stepping aside, getting back to work over at Lions247.com, I am Tyler Donahue. Thanks again to Chris Anderson from the West Virginia site for joining us, and before him, my colleague Daniel Gallen from Lions247.com. We'll talk to you real soon right here on the Lions247 Podcast.